When Jason and Alicia met with my wife and I, they were in tough shape. Jason had just found out about his wife's affair and he was very angry, and understandably so. With a great deal of emotion, he said, I'll never forgive her for this. Well, this is not an uncommon situation. My wife and I regularly meet with couples that have experienced a major breach of trust. Sometimes it's a shocking revelation, and sometimes it's just something that occurs over a long period of time. One of the most common is infidelity, where one of the partner learns about their spouse's adultery and it's deeply hurt. But there are other big breaches of trust too. There's things like addictions and abuse and lies, or just irresponsibly handing money, others. And the marriage relationship can heal, but it's going to take some time, and the hurt needs to be processed. And at some point in the healing process, the couples need to deal with forgiveness and trust. And this is where it gets confusing and misconceptions are common. So we recommend that you separate forgiveness and trust. Ideally, a relationship is restored when both partners forgive each other and agree not to do the harmful behavior. And that sounds really easy, but it can be a long process. And separating forgiveness and trust makes it easier to work through the process. So we explain that there is a forgiveness process and there is a restoring trust process, and they're two different things. When we don't separate forgiveness and trust, it confuses the issue. We hear things like, I thought you forgave me. Why do you keep bringing that up? Or, what you did is not right and I can't condone it. Or, let's just forgive and forget about it, okay? Or, I'll forgive when they... doesn't the Bible say you have to trust me again? So I've experienced kind of two types of scenarios. One scenario is a person that offers forgiveness very quickly. Then they work through the hurt. And the second scenario is that a person wants to process all of the hurt before they'll say, I forgive you. So that's the tough part of what do you hear? Regardless of the approach the person takes, here's two big truths. One, forgiveness. Big hurts require that the anger and pain be processed, and this takes time. And two, trust. The offender needs to prove they are trustworthy, and this also takes time. Often the offender doesn't like hearing about the hurt they have caused, and the worst thing they can do is to ignore or dismiss it. The offended one needs to grieve, but they also can't stay there. There's a time for being hurt and angry, and there's a time to let it go. And there's not an easy answer for how long this should take. So we break it into two processes. There's the forgiveness process and the trust process. So what is forgiveness? Well, forgiveness is about giving up the right to a debt. It's about releasing the hurt, the anger, and the resentment. The offended party is the one that needs to process and release the hurt. Forgiveness doesn't mean that you're going to be in a relationship with someone. Forgiving isn't dependent on the actions of the offender. The offender may never be sorry for what they've done, and they may never apologize. And our forgiveness of them doesn't depend upon what they do. That's where forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a relationship. But the forgiveness process is about not getting stuck in either resentment or anger or dismissing the hurt and shutting down your feelings. When you've truly forgiven someone, there isn't any more resentment, and you can talk about it without pain. So what's trust? Well, trust is about restoring the relationship. This requires action from the offender. The offender has to prove that they are trustworthy, and it requires work. Trust may require that the offender understand the hurt they have caused. This means listening to your spouse explaining how you've hurt them. And it might mean hearing some of the same hurt over and over again as your partner works on grieving and understanding what happened. Trust also requires predictable behavior. In other words, I know where you are and I trust what you are doing. This might mean agreeing to being monitored by your partner as you prove your trustworthiness. So how do you separate the two? When Jason told us that he would never forgive Alicia, we suspected that he had a misconception. He was a Christian and he knew the teaching on forgiveness. So I asked him, tell me more about that. And as he talked, I realized that what he really meant was that he could never condone her actions. To him, if he forgave her, it was somehow saying that her behavior was acceptable. And Alicia agreed that what she did was wrong. So we separated forgiveness and trust. And we explained that there's a forgiveness process and a trust process. And we wanted him to forgive her even if he left Alicia and decided not to have a relationship with her. But it means that he has to work through his anger and his hurt. And forgiveness is letting go of the pain regardless of Alicia's actions. So we explained to Alicia that if she wanted to help Jason to process his feelings, she could listen to him. And the two of them did want a relationship that would be rebuilt. And so that required also then rebuilding trust. And Alicia would need to work on demonstrating her trustworthiness. And so we talked through ways that Alicia could demonstrate that she wasn't in contact with the other men. And she willingly allowed Jason access to all of her online accounts and her cell phone. Trust is not instantaneous. It takes time to reestablish. The two of them worked on forgiving and rebuilding trust at the same time. It was a tough road, but today they have a fantastic marriage. So separating forgiveness and trust helps a couple not to be confused by misconceptions. So some tips for marriage mentors. 1, separate forgiveness and trust. These are two separate things. For a couple that wants to restore a relationship, both of those processes are going to be required. 2, forgiveness is a process. Understand that you have been hurt, how you've been hurt, and you can take some thought and some prayer. And big hurts require some time to identify what you're forgiving and for grieving the loss. And 3, trust is a process. Trust can be restored, but it also takes work. The offender must be willing to prove their own trustworthiness, and it takes time. So those 3 tips again: 1, separate forgiveness and trust. 2, forgiveness is a process. And 3, trust is a process.